Tonight, let me tell you about the two most audacious con men in American history, Philip Arnold and John Slack, a pair of broke prospectors who convinced the richest titans of the Gilded Age to hand over millions for a diamond field that didn't exist. This is the story of how greed makes geniuses stupid, and how the perfect lie is always the one people desperately want to believe. To understand the scale of this con, you first have to understand who they fooled. They conned the founder of Tiffany Co into certifying worthless stones as genuine. They conned Horace Greeley, the most influential newspaper publisher in America. They conned generals who'd won Civil War battles and railroad barons who'd built empires of steel. At its peak, their phantom diamond field was valued at over $100 million, more than $1 billion in today's money. And it all started with one canvas bag of salted gems and two men who understood that rich men see what they want to see. If you appreciate history with the propaganda peeled off and the ugly truth exposed, the kind where America's smartest men prove themselves spectacularly stupid, consider subscribing and dropping a comment with where you're listening from. I'm curious who else enjoys watching Titans fall for the oldest trick in the book. Now take a slow, deep breath, settle into your coziest spot. Let the modern world fade into San Francisco fog. We're going back to 1872, to a wood-panelled office where diamonds are spilling across mahogany, and the greatest con of the 19th century is reaching its crescendo. The scroll is open. Let's begin. Every good con needs an artist. This particular con had two, Philip Arnold and John Slack. Their names don't echo through history the way their marks' names do. No buildings bear their names. No foundations carry their legacy forward, which is exactly how they wanted it. They weren't masterminds. That's important to understand from the start. They didn't possess genius-level intellects or elaborate criminal pedigrees. They were just opportunists who understood one simple, fatalistic truth about the world they inhabited. The Gilded Age wasn't built on genius. It was built on hysteria. Philip Arnold was the brains of the operation, though even that term gives him more credit than he deserves. He was a Kentucky man, rough around the edges in a way that seemed authentic because it was. His hands bore the calluses of real work, years spent in California's gold fields, then South Africa's diamond mines. That experience was his greatest asset, not because it had made him wealthy, it hadn't, but because it had given him something more valuable than gold. It had taught him what greed looked like up close. He'd watched men lose their minds over rumours, seen fortunes change hands based on nothing but whispers and wishful thinking. He knew what a real uncut diamond looked like, certainly. But more importantly, he knew what diamond fever looked like, and he knew that experts, men in expensive suits with impressive credentials, were just men waiting to be fooled by something they wanted to believe. Arnold spoke slowly, choosing words carefully, which made him sound thoughtful when he was actually just cautious. People mistook his silence for wisdom. He never corrected them. John Slack was the partner, the mule, in con artist terms, the face. He had unremarkable features that slipped from memory, perfect for a con man who needed to be forgettable. His greatest talent was looking incapable of sophisticated deception. He was perfect. The two men had worked together in the California gold fields, bonded by shared poverty and shared resentment. They'd watched others strike it rich while their own pans came up empty. They'd seen claim jumpers and swindlers prosper, while honest labour earned them nothing but aching backs and empty pockets. Somewhere in those long, frustrating years, a cynical understanding had crystallised between them. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, and if you couldn't beat it through honest work, well, there were other approaches. Arnold didn't just have a story to sell. He had experience to back it up. He'd actually been to South Africa's diamond fields. He'd actually handled rough stones. He knew the geology, knew the terminology, knew which questions experts would ask and how to answer them with just enough detail to sound authentic without revealing he was performing. The men in New York, the titans with their banks and railroads and vast fortunes, they were the smartest men in the country, which also made them the most vulnerable, because smart men hate being told no. Smart men believe they can see opportunities others miss. Smart men think they're too intelligent to be conned. Arnold and Slack knew better. They'd been watching the country go mad with speculation for decades now. Gold in California had sent thousands rushing west. Silver in Nevada had triggered another wave of hysteria. The pattern was clear. The world was itching to go mad again. All it needed was a spark. So Arnold and Slack decided to provide one. Not with gold this time. Everyone had heard the gold stories, knew the odds, understood the disappointment that waited at the end of most rainbow chases. Silver was already fading, its boom years sliding into ordinary extraction and industrial routine. No, what the world needed, what the titans of finance would hunger for, was something different, something exotic, something that suggested unlimited wealth concentrated in small, portable packages. Diamonds. The idea wasn't original, which was part of its brilliance. Diamonds had mystique. They came from exotic places, India, Brazil, recently South Africa. They were rare enough to seem valuable, common enough that finding a new source seemed plausible, and unlike gold or silver, diamonds didn't require complex refining. Find them, pick them up, sell them. Simple, elegant, irresistible. Arnold began building the con the way a mason builds a wall, one careful brick at a time. He started talking, casually, to other prospectors. Mentioned he'd seen some interesting geology in Colorado. Nothing definite, just observations. Let slip that certain rock formations reminded him of what he'd seen in South Africa. Never pushed it, never made it sound important, just planted seeds. Meanwhile, Slack played his role, the loyal partner, the steady presence, the man who seemed too simple to invent anything complex. When people asked him about Arnold's theory, he'd shrug. Say Arnold knew rocks better than he did, give vague confirmations that they'd found some interesting stones, probably nothing, but interesting. They were setting the stage, building credibility through understatement, creating a story before they even had a mind to show for it, because that's how the best lies work. They start so small, so casual, that nobody realizes they're being set up until the trap has already closed. The year was 1871 when Arnold and Slack finally made their move. They'd spent months planning, saving what little money they could scrape together and preparing for the con of a lifetime. What they needed now was capital, real money, the kind that would let them buy what they needed and travel where they needed to go. But first, they needed to find the perfect stage for their performance. Not just any location would work. It had to be remote enough that verifying their story would be difficult. It had to be plausible enough that experts wouldn't immediately dismiss it. It had to be impressive enough that the marks would believe they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. Arnold studied maps late into the night, considering options. Colorado seemed right. The territory was being actively surveyed, which gave it legitimacy. But it was also vast, with plenty of unmapped corners where a man could salt a claim and buy himself months before anyone thought to check his work. The terrain was brutal enough to discourage casual investigation, and it was American soil, which mattered. Finding diamonds in some foreign land would trigger different kinds of questions, different levels of skepticism. Somewhere in northwestern Colorado, near the Wyoming border, remote, God-forsaken, miles from anything, a mesa that looked like dozens of other mesas in that part of the world. Unremarkable except for what Arnold and Slack would carefully place there. They had their stage, now they needed the props, and that meant a trip to Europe, because the best lies always have details that check out when people start asking questions. The irony wasn't lost on Arnold. He was about to spend every dollar he had buying worthless stones to convince rich men they'd found priceless ones. But that was the beautiful simplicity of the con. The gems would be real, just not valuable, not in their current state anyway. Industrial-grade refuse, the kind of rough stones that legitimate dealers threw away because they weren't worth cutting. He smiled when he thought about it, which was rare for him, a small, cold expression that never reached his eyes. The titans in their oak-panelled offices, surrounded by luxury, would soon be begging two broke prospectors for the privilege of investing in a pile of garbage. Greed, Arnold knew, made a better partner than any man ever could, because greed never asked questions it didn't want answered. The stage was being set, the props were being gathered. Arnold and Slack were transforming themselves from desperate prospectors into the stars of the greatest geological discovery of the century. The Marks didn't know it yet. They were still in their mansions and boardrooms, still counting their millions, still congratulating themselves on their shrewd business sense and superior judgment. But the trap was already built. It just needed bait, and soon Philip Arnold would walk into a San Francisco bank carrying a bag that would make the richest men in America lose their minds. The con was about to begin in earnest. But you can't just tell a lie, not a big one, not the kind that fools titans and reshapes fortunes. You have to build it. Construct it with the same meticulous care that a master forger brings to a banknote. Every detail matters. Every element must withstand scrutiny, because the bigger the lie, the harder people will look, at least until greed blinds them to what's actually there. Arnold and Slack understood this, so they approached their con like professionals, which in a way, they were. Their profession just happened to be fraud. The first step took them to London in the spring of 1871. A transatlantic voyage on a steamship where Arnold kept to himself, studying geology texts in his cabin while other passengers socialised in the salons. He needed to know what questions would be asked, needed to understand what experts would look for. The difference between success and exposure lived in those details. London's Diamond District occupied a few narrow streets where small shops with reinforced doors conducted business that moved millions. These weren't the fancy establishments that sold engagement rings to wealthy couples. These were the workshops where the real trade happened, where rough stones from Africa and Brazil arrived in bulk, where cutters and dealers sorted through material, keeping the gems worth cutting and discarding everything else. Arnold spent months tracking down dealers who could provide stones without asking too many questions. He bought carefully, not too much from any one dealer, never enough to raise questions. Diamonds, yes, but also rubies. Garnets that could pass for rubies in poor light. Sapphires with occlusions that made them worthless to jewellers but perfectly adequate for a con. Some emeralds, though not many. Emeralds were rarer, harder to explain geologically. The mixture was important. Too much of one thing would seem suspicious, but a diverse scattering suggested a formation of impossible richness. By the time Arnold left London, he'd spent nearly $20,000, roughly $500,000 in today's money. Every cent he and Slack had saved, borrowed, or scraped together. It was a fortune to them. To the men they planned to con, it was a rounding error. The irony of spending their life savings on worthless stones to convince rich men they'd found priceless ones wasn't lost on Arnold. He appreciated irony. It was one of the few luxuries he could afford. The stage they'd chosen sat in northwestern Colorado, near the Wyoming border. A mesa rising from scrubland like a broken tooth. No settlements within 50 miles, no roads. Just game trails and the occasional track left by survey parties. The kind of place where a man could work unobserved for weeks if he planned it right. Arnold and Slack reached it in late summer, approaching from different directions to avoid suspicion, meeting at a predetermined landmark. They brought shovels, trowels, a ramrod, basic camping supplies. The work ahead would take time. This wasn't about randomly scattering gems and hoping for the best. This was art. The sound of metal on rock echoed across empty land. Arnold on his hands and knees, using a trowel to create small crevices in rock faces, then carefully pressing uncut diamonds into them. Not too deep. They needed to be discoverable. Not too shallow. They needed to look natural. The sun beat down with that high-altitude intensity. Their hands bled from sharp stone edges. Slack worked the creek bed, sprinkling rubies into gravel like a farmer sowing seeds. In one spot, Arnold used a ramrod to force a diamond deep into an anthill. Anthills had been there for years. A stone discovered in such a formation couldn't possibly have been planted recently. For 3 weeks they worked. They salted perhaps 50 acres of Mesa, creating a pattern that would suggest a much larger diamond field. They weren't just salting a mine. They were salting the imagination of the Gilded Age, setting a trap for men who believed they were too smart to be fooled. They weren't really selling diamonds, they were selling possibility. And in America's Gilded Age, dreams sold for more than reality ever could. By September, the stage was set. Arnold and Slack packed their gear and prepared for the most important part of any con, making the marks come to them. The trap was perfect, now it needed victims, and in 1872 San Francisco, finding wealthy marks was as easy as throwing a stone, though Arnold and Slack planned to use considerably more valuable stones than that. William Ralston was the founder of the Bank of California, a man who'd helped build San Francisco from a gold rush tent city into the financial capital of the West. He had the kind of money that most men couldn't even conceptualize. Railroads, mines, banks, shipping. His investments spiderwebbed across the continent. He was also a speculator who'd made his fortune on calculated risks, which meant he was always hungry for the next big opportunity. In other words, he was perfect. Arnold and Slack arrived in San Francisco looking exactly like what they pretended to be. Prospectors who'd been in the field too long, clothes dusty and worn, boots scuffed. That slightly feral quality that men get when they've been away from civilization for months. They weren't acting. This was method preparation. They moved through the city cautiously, 2 men carrying something valuable and trying not to draw attention to it, which, of course, was the surest way to draw attention. They appeared at the Bank of California on a Tuesday morning, haggard, nervous, speaking in whispers to each other while standing in the lobby. When they approached a clerk, Arnold's request was simple. They needed to store something in the bank's vault, something valuable, something they didn't trust to keep in their hotel room. The clerk, accustomed to prospectors with modest stakes, began to explain the procedure. Then Arnold opened the bag just slightly, just enough for the clerk to see what was inside. The clerk's eyes widened. He excused himself. Moments later, he returned with the supervisor. The supervisor took one look into that bag and excused himself. Within 20 minutes, William Ralston himself appeared. Arnold and Slack were reluctant. They'd practiced this reluctance carefully. They didn't want to show anyone. It was too valuable, too important. They just needed a safe place to store it temporarily. They were heading back out soon, needed to retrieve the rest of the claim. Ralston, a man who'd built an empire on reading people and opportunities, employed every ounce of his considerable charm. He assured them of complete confidentiality. The bank's vault was the safest in the West. He personally guaranteed their security. Arnold exchanged glances with Slack. A wordless conversation between partners who'd worked together too long to need speech. Finally, with apparent reluctance, Arnold nodded, but only in Ralston's private office, with the door closed. The bag was opened on Ralston's mahogany desk. Uncut diamonds spilled out like ordinary gravel, catching the lamplight in fractured rainbows. Rubies followed, deep red and rough-edged. sapphires in shades from pale blue to nearly black. Ralston's breathing changed, became shallow. His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the stones, then stopped, looking to Arnold for permission. Arnold nodded, playing his role perfectly. A simple man who didn't quite understand what he'd found but knew it was valuable. Ralston picked up a diamond, turned it in the light. His experience with precious stones was limited, but he'd seen enough to know these were real, flawed, certainly industrial grade at best. But to his eyes already seeing not what was there but what might be, they were the key to infinite wealth. The questions came carefully. Where had they found these? Arnold was vague. Colorado. Up in the mountains. Remote location. Hard to reach. They'd been surveying for silver when they noticed unusual rock formations. Started picking around and found these scattered in the creek bed and embedded in the stone. How many more were there? Arnold shrugged with practiced uncertainty. Hard to say. They'd only scratched the surface. Picked up what they could carry easily. But the way the stones were distributed suggested a much larger deposit. Could be nothing. Could be the biggest discovery since California. Slack said almost nothing, which was his role. He just nodded occasionally in confirming Arnold's vague statements, playing the loyal partner who let the smart one do the talking. Ralston made his move. He wanted to invest, wanted to help them develop this claim properly. They needed capital, equipment, security. He could provide all of that. They'd be partners. Arnold refused, politely but firmly. They'd worked too hard, risked too much, to just hand over their discovery to the first banker who showed interest. They knew what they had. They just needed somewhere safe to store it while they organized their next expedition. The refusal was masterful, because it did what every good con requires. It made the mark work for the privilege of being robbed. Ralston didn't just want in now, he needed in. The possibility of being excluded from the greatest mineral discovery of the century gnawed at him like hunger. Over the next several days, Ralston applied pressure, not crude pressure. He was too sophisticated for that. But he made sure Arnold and Slack understood what he could offer. Introductions to other investors, legal protection for their claim, political connections that could smooth any difficulties with territorial authorities. Arnold resisted, but each meeting, each conversation, he revealed a little more, let slip slightly more specific details. Mentioned that maybe, if the right partners came forward, men they could trust, they might consider bringing in outside capital. Ralston assembled his own consortium, called in favours, reached out to contacts in New York and Europe. Within weeks, some of the most powerful men in America were quietly circling this opportunity, like sharks scenting blood in the water. Horace Greeley, founder of the New York Tribune, the most influential newspaper in America, his word could move markets, start wars, end political careers. General George McClellan, former Union commander during the Civil War, the man who'd led armies, run for president, and now sat on boards of directors across the financial sector. Charles Lewis Tiffany, William Lent, railroad barons and industrial magnates, men who'd built America's Gilded Age through shrewd judgment and careful analysis. And they were about to fall for a con so obvious that, in hindsight, people would wonder how anyone believed it. Here's the secret to a good con, the part that makes it work every single time. The Mark always thinks it's his idea. Arnold and Slack didn't sell these titans anything. They didn't have to. The titans sold themselves. They acted reluctant, scared, simple. Just two prospectors who'd stumbled onto something big and didn't quite know how to handle it. And the titans, men accustomed to being the smartest people in every room. They competed for the privilege of investing. They called in favours, offered terms, practically begged for the opportunity to hand over their money. Arnold and Slack had sold them their own egos. Within 6 weeks of that first meeting at the Bank of California, the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company was formed, capitalized at $10 million, roughly $300 million in today's money. The stock certificates were printed on heavy paper with elaborate scroll work, as if the expense of the printing somehow validated the company's worth. Arnold and Slack owned shares, of course, but they'd also negotiated immediate payment for showing the investors the location of the mine. $600,000 in cash, split between them, money that would be theirs regardless of what happened afterward. The Titans were ecstatic. They'd done it. They'd secured the investment opportunity of the century. Now all they needed was for an expert to verify what they already knew to be true. The trap was about to snap shut. But the Titans weren't stupid. Not completely. They understood that due diligence wasn't optional when investing millions. They needed verification from someone with credentials, someone whose reputation would lend legitimacy to their venture. They needed an expert. So they hired the most respected private mining engineer in the country, Henry Janin. Janin had made his fortune consulting for major mining operations across the West. His reports were gospel in investment circles. A positive evaluation from Janin could launch a company. A negative one could sink it before the first share was sold. His fee was substantial, but for the Titans backing the diamond venture, his fee was irrelevant. What they needed was his stamp of approval. What they didn't consider was that Henry Janin's expertise was in precious metals. Gold, silver, copper. He knew nothing about diamonds, but he wasn't about to admit that. Not to the Titans of New York, not for the biggest payday of his career. So he did what experts throughout history have done when confronted with questions outside their knowledge. He projected confidence and hoped the details would sort themselves out. There was another expert they might have called. Should have called, really. Clarence King, head of the United States Geological Survey's 40th Parallel Survey. 30 years old, but already considered one of the most brilliant geologists in America. His mandate was to map and assess the mineral resources of the Western Territories. If there was a massive diamond discovery in Colorado, it was quite literally King's job to know about it. His team had been surveying that exact region. He'd walked that ground, catalogued those formations, published reports on what minerals could and couldn't be found there. But the Titans didn't call King. They called Janin instead, a private consultant they could control, whose report they'd paid for, whose conclusions would serve their needs. They had no idea they'd just personally insulted the one man on Earth with both the expertise and the motivation to destroy their con. Clarence King wasn't just a scientist, he was ambitious, proud, and acutely aware of his reputation. The implication that his survey had somehow missed the greatest geological discovery of the century was a professional humiliation he wouldn't tolerate. But that would come later. For now, Henry Janin had a job to do. Arnold and Slack were delighted when they learned Janin would be conducting the site inspection. Not King, the government geologist who might actually know what he was looking at, but Janin, a man whose expertise lay elsewhere, a man who'd be desperate to validate the site because admitting ignorance would mean admitting he'd taken money under false pretenses. The journey to the diamond field was carefully orchestrated. Arnold and Slack insisted on guiding Janin themselves. They took a deliberately confusing route, doubling back, camping in seemingly random locations, claiming they were avoiding claim jumpers and ne'er-do-wells. By the time they reached the Mesa, Janin had no clear idea where he actually was, which was precisely the point. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when they reached the site. Arnold led Janin to a spot he and Slack had carefully prepared months earlier. "Here," Arnold said quietly, speaking with the reluctance of a man sharing secrets. Janin approached with appropriate professional gravity. He examined the formation, noted the rock type in his notebook. Then he began to dig. The trowel scraped against rock, once, twice. Then Janin's breathing changed. He'd found a diamond, wedged into a crevice, glinting in the morning light. Arnold watched with the perfect expression of a man seeing confirmation of what he already knew. Janin extracted the stone carefully, turned it in the light, examined it with a jeweler's loupe he'd brought for exactly this purpose. Real, uncut, rough, but definitely a diamond. He moved to another spot Arnold indicated, dug again. Found a ruby this time, its deep red colour unmistakable even in its rough state. Then a sapphire, then another diamond. Each find confirmed what Janin desperately wanted to believe, that he was presiding over a legitimate discovery, that his expertise was being properly applied, that the enormous fee he'd charged was justified. What he didn't notice, what he couldn't notice without expertise in diamond geology, was the impossibility of what he was finding. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds don't occur together naturally. They form under different geological conditions, in different types of rock, requiring different pressures and temperatures. Finding them all in the same formation was like finding polar bears and palm trees growing side by side. It couldn't happen. It was geologically impossible, but Janin didn't know that. His expertise was in gold and silver, where veins could run rich with multiple minerals. He assumed diamonds worked the same way. Why wouldn't they? For 3 days. Janin inspected the site. He dug in multiple locations, each one carefully indicated by Arnold as particularly promising. He found stones in nearly every spot. The distribution seemed random enough to be natural, concentrated enough to suggest significant reserves. He filled bags with samples, took extensive notes, performed calculations on extraction costs, potential yields, and estimated total value. The numbers grew larger with each page of his notebook. Millions of dollars in diamonds, he projected. Possibly billions if the field extended as far as the surface distribution suggested. On the final evening, as they camped under stars that filled the sky like spilled diamonds themselves, Janin shared his preliminary conclusions. The field was genuine. The stones were real. Subject to a full assay of his samples back in San Francisco, he was prepared to recommend immediate development. Arnold and Slack received this news with quiet satisfaction, not celebration. That would have been out of character. Just the nods of men who'd had their suspicions confirmed by someone smarter than themselves. The return journey was triumphant. Janin composed his report in his head, already anticipating the accolades. He'd verified the greatest mineral discovery in American history. His name would be attached to this find forever. Books would be written. His reputation would reach heights no mining consultant had ever achieved. Janin's official report ran 40 pages, dense with technical language, geological terminology, and confident assertions. The conclusion was unambiguous. The diamond field was genuine, vast, and potentially the richest gemstone deposit ever discovered. He estimated its value in the billions. The report was circulated privately among investors. Within days, the New York Tribune published a story announcing the discovery to the world. Other newspapers picked it up. The headlines screamed of American diamonds rivaling the mines of Brazil and South Africa. The stock market responded with predictable hysteria. The San Francisco and New York mining and commercial companies' valuations soared. Men who'd invested early were suddenly sitting on paper fortunes. New investors clamoured to buy in. The con had achieved something extraordinary. It had transformed from private fraud into public truth simply because enough important people believed it. Charles Tiffany himself examined samples from the field. His expertise in cut and finished gems didn't extend to rough stones in unusual matrices, but his name appeared in testimonials nonetheless. If Tiffany said they were real, they must be real. The expert had signed off. The press had printed the legend. The titans had validated the con with their reputations. The lie was now too big, too rich, too well documented to fail. And why? Because Janin wanted to believe. Because Tiffany wanted to believe. Because all of them, every expert, every investor, every newspaper editor, they needed to believe. The opportunity was too vast, the potential too extraordinary, the glory too appealing. They'd done Arnold and Slack's work for them. They'd convinced themselves. They'd built elaborate justifications, hired prestigious validators, created mechanisms of verification that all confirmed what they desperately wanted to be true. The con was complete. The lie had become truth, and somewhere in San Francisco, two broke prospectors were about to become very, very rich. But in Washington, D.C., a 30-year-old geologist was reading that New York Tribune article with growing fury. Clarence King had just learned about the greatest mineral discovery in his survey territory, a discovery that, according to the papers, had somehow escaped his notice entirely. The detective had entered the case. The con was perfect. The money was flowing. Arnold and Slack were weeks away from executing their exit strategy. But every perfect crime has one variable the criminals can't control. In this case, it was a 30-year-old government geologist with a wounded ego and the expertise to know what everyone else had missed. Clarence King. King wasn't just any geologist. He was ambitious in a way that made other ambitious men seem lazy. By 30, he'd already led the 40th parallel survey, mapping the West from California to the Rockies. His surveys were the gold standard. When investors wanted to know what was actually underground, they consulted King's reports, and now the papers were claiming that the biggest mineral discovery in American history had occurred in his survey territory without his knowledge. The insult was professional and personal. King read Janin's report with the careful attention of a surgeon examining a malpractice case. The geological terminology was correct but vague. The descriptions were impressive but imprecise, and the claims, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, and emeralds all in the same formation, were geologically absurd. King's motivation wasn't pure scientific integrity, though he'd have claimed it was. This was personal. This was about pride, about reputation, about proving that Henry Janin was a fool and that Clarence King was the only true expert. The con had accidentally created a rivalry. Arnold and Slack had succeeded in avoiding the government geologist until it was too late to course correct. King pulled every piece of information he could find about the diamond field. He interviewed people who'd visited it. He examined samples that investors were passing around like party favors. He read geological reports from the region, cross-referenced formations, checked his own survey maps. Everything he saw confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't a discovery, it was a fraud. The geology was wrong. The distribution pattern was wrong. The stone types were impossible. It was like claiming to find a forest where oaks, palms, pines, and baobabs all grew together naturally. It couldn't happen. The conditions that create diamonds are completely different from those that create rubies or sapphires. Finding them in the same formation was geologically impossible, but saying so without proof would make him look like a jealous rival. Janin had been there, had dug the samples himself, had written a detailed report. King's objections, no matter how scientifically sound, would seem like sour grapes. He needed to go there, needed to see it himself, needed to document the fraud so thoroughly that no one could dispute it. Time was working against him. It was already November 1872. Winter came early and brutal in the Colorado high country. The season for fieldwork was over. Smart geologists were back in their offices writing reports, not climbing frozen mountains. But King wasn't operating on a normal schedule anymore. He was operating on rage and wounded pride and the certainty that he was right. He assembled a small team from his survey crew, men who'd worked with him before, who trusted his judgment. who were willing to do something monumentally stupid for pay and loyalty. The challenge was simple and enormous. They had to find a mesa somewhere in northwestern Colorado that Arnold and Slack had deliberately left vague and Janin had been too confused to properly locate. They had to do it in November, when snow was already falling. They had to reach it, document it, and return before winter made travel impossible. King had one advantage. He knew the geology of the region better than anyone alive. He could eliminate possibilities, narrow the search area based on the vague descriptions in Janin's report. It was still looking for a specific mesa among hundreds, but at least it wasn't looking for a needle in the entire haystack of Colorado. The wind cut through layers of wool and canvas like they were silk. November in the Rockies was hostile. Temperatures stayed below freezing. The wind never stopped. King and his team rode into that wind like men possessed. Their horses struggled in deepening snow. One horse went lame on the third day. Another died on the fifth. King pushed forward. They camped in snow. Rationed food that had started to run low. The cold worked its way into decision-making. Slowed thought processes, made simple tasks feel monumental, while Arnold and Slack drank champagne in San Francisco, counting their take. Clarence King was freezing on a nameless mountain, driven by pride and the desperate need to prove he was the smartest man in the room. The con men had built their lie in the summer sun, working comfortably. King had to dismantle it in the dead of winter, working through agony, because truth requires evidence, documentation, proof that can withstand scrutiny. Lies can be adjusted when challenged. Truth has to stand or fall on facts alone. After 2 weeks of searching, King found it. A mesa that matched the vague descriptions, in an area that fit the geological hints buried in Janin's report. Not certainty, not yet, but strong enough probability that King called for camp. They approached the site at dawn, light revealing a landscape that seemed deliberately barren. No vegetation beyond sparse grass. Rock exposed in formations that King recognized from months of survey work. This was his territory, his expertise, his home ground. He began to dig. The first diamond appeared almost immediately. King's heart sank. His certainty wavered. Was Janin right after all? Had King dragged his team through hell on a fool's errand driven by wounded pride? Then his trained eye, the eye of a scientist, not a speculator, caught something wrong. The investigation wasn't over. It had only just begun. King crouched in the dirt, holding a diamond that shouldn't exist. For a moment, just a moment, doubt crowded in. All the certainty that had driven him through November storms, all the conviction that had nearly killed his horses and frostbitten his fingers, all of it wavered. Then his scientific training reasserted itself. Look closer. Always look closer. The diamond sat in his palm, catching weak morning light. Real, uncut, but wrong. King couldn't articulate what was wrong at first. It was instinct born from years examining geological samples. Something about how it sat in his hand, the way light moved through it, the pattern of occlusions. Then he saw it, the placement. He returned to the rock crevice where he'd found the stone, examined it carefully, methodically. The diamond had been placed point first into the crevice, shoved in deliberately, with force. Natural diamonds, when they occur in rock formations, don't sit point first. They form flat, develop along crystal planes, orient themselves according to the geological forces that created them. This diamond had been placed by human hands, positioned to look natural to an untrained eye but obviously artificial to anyone who knew what to look for. King moved to another location, found a ruby sitting on top of a rock, literally on top. The stone type was wrong. Rubies form in metamorphic rock. This was sedimentary. The ruby had been placed there. Sapphires in crevices too shallow for natural formation. emeralds in rock types that couldn't produce them. The distribution pattern was artificial. King sat on a rock as the full scope of the fraud revealed itself. Arnold and Slack had counted on greed blinding observers to obvious flaws. They'd counted on experts like Janin being too proud to admit ignorance. They'd been right, until now. King documented everything. Sketched the site, collected samples, wrote detailed notes. He was building proof that could withstand any challenge. The Mesa wasn't a mine. It was a crime scene. The return journey was brutal, but King barely felt it. He drove his team hard, pushing through snow and cold with renewed energy. He had evidence. He had proof. He had everything he needed to expose the fraud and destroy Henry Janin's reputation in the process. They reached San Francisco in early December. King went immediately to William Ralston's office, still wearing trail clothes covered in road dust and dried mud, looking like a madman but carrying documentation that would collapse a $10 million company. Ralston's office, expensive wood panelling, the smell of cigars and success. Ralston sat behind his massive desk, the very picture of Gilded Age prosperity. He was not pleased to see King. The government geologist represented an unwelcome intrusion into private enterprise. King didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out his findings methodically, scientifically, devastating in their precision. The geology was impossible. The stones were placed not natural. The entire field was salted. Every sample Janin had collected, every stone he'd verified, all of it planted by Arnold and Slack. He showed his evidence, sketches, samples, documentation that even a layman could understand. The diamonds placed point first, the ruby sitting on incompatible rock, the geological impossibility of the formation. Ralston's face went from florid to ashen in the space of a minute. He understood what this meant. The company was worthless. The investment was lost. More than that, he and the other titans had been made fools by two broke prospectors. Within an hour, emergency meetings were called. Investors assembled. King presented his findings to a room full of very angry, very powerful men who'd just lost millions. The New York Tribune, which had trumpeted the discovery, would need to print a retraction. Henry Janin's reputation was finished. The San Francisco and New York mining and commercial company collapsed faster than it had been built. Clarence King was hailed as a hero. The press praised his integrity, his expertise, his dedication to truth. He'd saved American investors from a massive fraud. He'd protected the nation's economy. He'd proven, once and for all, that government geologists were the real experts, not private consultants who took money to verify whatever their clients wanted verified. His reward was a handshake and a footnote in geology textbooks. And the artists, Philip Arnold and John Slack, by the time King's announcement hit the wires, they were gone. Long gone. They'd sold their shares months earlier, cashing out at the peak for $600,000, about $15 million in today's money, clean, untraceable. Spent the moment it hit their hands. Arnold returned to Kentucky, bought land, lived quietly but comfortably. Local authorities in San Francisco tried to pursue charges, but Kentucky wasn't interested in extraditing a local man who'd outsmarted some fancy California investors. Arnold died wealthy, years later. His obituary mentioning his adventures in mining, but nothing about fraud. Slack disappeared completely. No death certificate, no record of where he went or what name he used. Just vanished into the vastness of America, carrying his share of the take. He'd played his role perfectly. The forgettable face. The average man who nobody quite remembered. In the end, that anonymity was worth more than any reputation. The detective won. Clarence King told the truth. He exposed his rival as a fool and proved he was the smartest man in the room. His reward? A quiet thank you and a footnote in geology textbooks. The con men lost. Their lie was exposed. Their reward? They kept all the money and lived out their lives in comfort, never facing a day of legal consequence. The Titans learned an expensive lesson about greed, or they didn't. Within a year, they were investing in new schemes, their confidence barely dented. The biggest lie isn't the one you tell, it's the one people tell themselves. The case is closed, the con is complete. The Mesa sits in Colorado still, barren and ordinary. No plaque commemorates the site. The diamonds are long gone, the fortunes vanished like smoke. Settle in now, let the story drift into memory, into dream. The Titans in their offices, the prospectors with their lies, the geologist with his truth. All of them just actors in a play that's been running since the first human realized deception could be profitable. The curtain falls, the con is over. Sleep now.